George Gorman has said this regarding your comment about churches in the XX survey. We're not budgeting expense increase. Does this mean no salary increases for 2021 utility snow removal? The Lake Institute is the one that did the study that I was referring to. ECFA has one as well. But the one that had zero churches increasing total expenditures. Now, they may be increasing their staff calls for raises, but they're taking that away, either reducing staff in some way or other expenses so that their total plan is flat. And then the ones who are doing the best job of managing are those that are saying, now we actually are growing, or we hope to grow. And so this is what we're going to do if we get additional additional income. And others are saying, if our income isn't what we project it to be, this is a way that we're going to deal with that. We're going to defer these expenses. So thank you for that. Next question from Carolyn Ritchie. Our issue is our older members who are financially supported in church are passing away. Newer, younger members are not giving at the level of older members are giving. Are other churches having this same issue? They absolutely are. You need to tune in for the webinar on November the 4th, where we're going to break those things open and look at the giving patterns. We're going to look at it by age. We're going to look at it by income levels. We're going to look at it in a lot of different ways. But what you're experiencing, Carolyn, is common, but it doesn't have to be that way. There are certainly best practices. Churches who are thriving are implementing, are working off of basic principles that help them to disciple those younger donors to give. But how you do that looks very, very different. Next question from Terry. We're working with Horizons and they're moving us away from budget language. We are supposed to use ministry plan. It's difficult to create a spiritual shift if the webinars continue to use the word budget. Absolutely busted there, Terry. You are right. We recommend the use of ministry plans, but not everybody is working with us and has adopted that. We communicate with a large number of churches. And so we elected to use the term budget, which actually is a accounting process. But when you are speaking about that to your congregations, your ministry funding plan, it is the language that I like best. At a minimum, ministry budget is a way that you can make that transition. And then what you have is a ministry funding plan, how you're going to raise giving, and a ministry spending plan, how you're going to do impact. George again. George says, any recommendations on prioritizing local community-based ministry costs versus payment to the denomination's home office? It's called mission shares in the Methodist Church. It's an allocation that we receive of the expenses run to the conference or collection of churches. Which is more important? I understand the question that you're asking is, what's more important, funding ministry or sending your mission shares to the conference office? Stan, you are a pastor. You've sat in that chair. Why don't you take a crack at that one?
By default, I would, that is a tough question. I would say by default, there's if you will, obligations, there's responsibilities to your denomination. You're a part of a denomination, and you've agreed to that through a variety of agreements and language in contracts or bylaws. But I would also say communication is the most important piece. If you're finding yourself in a position where you're struggling financially, reach out to your conference leader, to your relationship person in the conference, and talk through it with them, because they should also understand that if you're not engaging the local community, you're not going to thrive, which will then impact your ability to give them your denominational allocation in subsequent years. My guess is a godly spiritual denominational leader will work with you to say, let's work on this together. We'll help support you one way or another, either by reducing your allocation, providing additional resources, and we may even help you figure out how to best have more community impact without being a win-lose. We need to find win-win solutions so that we're helping the denomination who's helping us, along with helping the local community that we're charged to impact. So that's why I prefer to have that win-win of, let's bring the denomination in to help us solve this in an effective way that, you know, we all feel that we're making a difference.
So Sydney asked this question about 2021 donation revenue being lower. People have continued to make their 2020 pledge contributions, but expecting less pledges for 2021. How do we estimate that? So I think you're asking the question, what do we see in regard for giving in 2021? And again, I referred you back to the webinar next week, November the 4th, where we're going to be talking about that. There are a number of factors at play, not a single factor at play. There's the economic side of it. There is people's engagement. There are people's engagement with the church. There's this long-term trend of shifting dollars from religious giving to other nonprofit giving. I actually expect that Americans will give about the same percentage of their GDP next year that they gave this year, to the degree that GDP is lower. And right now, even with today's economic news, we're still playing catch up. We're still at a lower level of GDP, which would suggest that giving is coming down. Now, there are donor surveys that, at least to the end of the year, there's one that came out that said about 25% are looking to increase their giving. About 15% are looking to decrease their giving in comparison to next year. And the rest are in the middle, doing about the same. Now, that's broad. The question is, in your church, and that is going to, whether they're giving to you or not, is a question that we'll try to answer next week. So I hope that I hope that was helpful to you. I do think that we'll still have a significant number of churches seeing increase in giving next year. Most are not planning for that because because of the uncertainties and the challenges that they face in 2021, which still a lot of unknowns around that. So Craig Miller, our mortgage lender, has allowed us a 3-month interest payment deferral. The interest will be payable at the end of the mortgage term. So they've allowed them to put that back on. We're on an accrual basis. Is it correct to show the interest as a current period expense or not until paid sometime in the future? Some committee members believe it should not be shown in our general fund deficit surplus. What is the correct answer? That definitely sounds like an accounting question, Stan. Why don't you jump into the GAAP requirements on that?
Yeah, so yeah, I don't have enough information to declare an answer, but the guiding principles are, if you have restructured so that those payments are now a long-term liability, they're no longer short-term. So that then would cause you then to say, that goes from a current liability to a long-term liability on your balance sheet. But without knowing specifics of the amounts and the structure of what that looks like, well, in essence, what I'm hearing from the question is there's 3 months of interest that are being capitalized, attached to the loan as payments in the future that you'll be paying interest on between now and, I don't know the terms of the loan. Is it, are there 3 years left, or are you 30 years into the mortgage, or is this a 7-year, balloon note? There's so many modifications there that I'm not really sure. But the guiding principle is, if you have shifted current expense to a long-term liability, then it leaves your current balance sheet liability to a long-term balance sheet liability.
So Jeff asked this question: is there data around the risk and rewards of asking valued, non-appointed ministry staff who make up the larger portion of our variable payroll costs to take a reduction in pay due to the position no longer supporting a full-time paid position? So I think the question is reducing someone from full-time to three-quarter time or half-time, what's the risk and rewards on it? Stan, you probably see that as much as either one of us.
Yeah, that's a very insightful question, and it's also a very painful response. The reality is we love our staff, and nobody ever wants to go through a layoff. But what we do see, unfortunately, is within the church context or the ministry context, we tend to extend a lot more grace and mercy and compassion beyond the needs of the organization. And so a lot of times we'll keep somebody on that we don't need full time. Sometimes we'll keep on staff a low performer that affects the church's ability to have greater impact in the community. And so just like if we need a different skill set altogether, and we've got some positions, we don't want the people to leave, but they can't fill those roles. Sometimes we need to vacate certain positions that we aren't doing that ministry anymore, or we don't need it to do it that way, and repurpose those dollars and resteward those dollars to hire the talent that we need in a different skill set, or we need more of it. So if we've only had one audio visual tech, and now we need more camera and editing, we may or may not be able to use the preschool director to do that if they don't have any technical skills in that area. But the preschool is not opening and may not open again for a while. So we have to repurpose those dollars in those positions. That's just a crazy example off the top of my head, that given our current COVID environment that's so different. But I do think as leaders in the church, we absolutely have a stewardship responsibility to look at right sizing the organization, because it is the widow's mite and it is the generous contributions of the congregation that they're expecting to have the greatest impact on the community, not just provide positions and salaries for people.
So Betty asked this question. I'm hearing from our bishop that the expectation is that 2022 is actually going to be more physically difficult than 2021 with the ripple effect of the pandemic. Have you heard similar? I'm going to jump out there and say I don't have any sense of what 2022 is going to look like because of the unknowns that we have today. What we do know is that Americans give about the same amount of their GDP, almost a flat percentage, around 2% of GDP. And that's been consistent for over 40 years. It is only varied by a very small amount. So to the degree that the economy contracts, giving will contract with it. That's been the pattern since World War II, with only one exception. The caveat is that when giving goes down due to recession, it actually takes several years before it recovers. So giving is a lagging indicator. If GDP is falling right now, people are completing their estimate of givings for the year, and you're going to experience that in 2021. When people's income goes up, it takes them a while before they begin to give at that level. So it is giving is a trailing indicator, not a leading indicator of what's going on economically. And that's probably your best measure of where giving will go. Now, giving to the church has been literally in a free fall since it's about half of what it was in 1990. So that is a big challenge, being in the church world, and that has been accelerating, not decelerating, but it's largely concentrated in around 40% of churches, with the rest of them being stable or growing. So that becomes a question very unique to your settings. Dr. Yeah.
Let me also add in, I absolutely agree that 2022 is just too far away to have any reasonable expectations on. But let's even look at this year. In spite of all the economic indicators and a lot of the volatility and the levels of unemployment, the levels of businesses closing, a lot of us miss the fact that there are some business owners, some businesses that are having the best year in their history.
Yes.
So I'll pick on, a public, Amazon, it can't hire enough people. They're hiring 100,000, they're hiring 200,000. And certainly the stock prices are going through the roof. There are a handful of fast food restaurants that are doing fantastic, while so many restaurants are closing. So it's not there's not a parity. And so when we talk about, and this is not always mature in the church really lags the not-for-profit sector. The not-for-profit sector really understands their donor structure and the donor discipleship methods, where mid-level and major donors are saying right now they may actually give more this year than they've ever given in their history, because the profits of their particular businesses are up higher than ever, and or they've already set money aside that they realize this is the year to give because so many churches and organizations are hurting. So the macroeconomic issues are there. Churches don't normally tap into understanding the giving patterns and giving potential within their congregation. But I don't want to lose sight of that in the fact that we are being church focused on this conversation, but in a broader religious and charitable contribution setting, there's some, again, further dynamics that are fascinating to study in the next 90 days.
So here's a great question, comes from Anthony. Business leaders often say, cut, 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 a cautionary concern about this collaborative discussion. So we've talked about engaging particularly your entrepreneurs, and that there is a risk of cut, cut, cut. And if you only cut and you're cutting away ministry, that will accelerate your decline. So when you enter this conversation, if the cut reduces our ministry impact, it will in the long term reduce our giving. The question becomes then strategic cutting. Stan, I bet you hear this conversation all the time.
I do. And again, so we're not saying just bring any business leader into the conversation. We're saying the deep influential ones, the ones who are deeply involved. So when you're looking at people in your congregation who are giving significantly already, they're on the business side, whether they're an entrepreneur or an executive somehow, and they love the church and they don't want the church to be harmed, then they're the ones going to be saying, you know what, we need to prune here. We didn't say amputate. We want to surgically remove what we need to. We need to lose some weight, not lose an arm. And there's a difference to achieve the 10 pounds you need to lose. You don't want to lose the arm, but you might want to lose the fat. And they will be uniquely gifted to help you identify that if they love the church, if they're a part of it, and they can help make up the difference so that you can actually have more fuel to be more effective when we find a way to be running more efficiently and reducing some of the excesses that we may not be seeing otherwise because we're just too close to it.
So Anthony asked this question, what does deleverage mean? When I used the term earlier, I was talking about the relationship of your debt to your income. So deleveraging that, having a lower debt service against your income, and the importance of looking at reducing debt in 2021 and 2022, because recessions are great times to be reducing debt. A little more difficult to build in unless you've got a strong vision, but really great times to do debt reduction. That really also applies to the relationship between your fixed expenses and your income. The higher your fixed expenses are, the less margin you've got to work with. And so reducing your fixed expenses, creating more variable and less fixed, is also a form of deleveraging. Stan, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to add, to your point, we mentioned at the very beginning of this webinar that we have the Church Financial Health Index. It's a national database of church ratios and financials that we can work with you to get your church financials into the system. And then it will give you a trend if you're getting healthier or less healthy. How leveraged are you? What percentage of your expenses are fixed, variable? What percentage are tied to your occupancy, if you will, versus employee? And it's not just your own trends. We'll benchmark you. We'll give you the ratios against national benchmarks, and we have the capability to again show how you're doing against your peer churches by size and geography. And that's an incredible tool to say, how are we doing and how are our peer churches doing in reference to this current environment? So that becomes a great objective tool to help you understand where are we and what do we need to do? Are we spending too much on our employees? Are we spending too much on our facilities? Do we have enough money left to have community impact in our ministry plans?
So we've just got a few questions left. We're about 15 minutes over our time. We're trying to get as many questions answered as we can. Since the majority of folks are still with us, we're imagining that you're finding this to be helpful. So we're going to go a little quicker. Joy asked about the link to the November 4th webinar. We will send that to you for signing up here, but it is posted in the chat, so you can look at that now. Carl asked the question, I may have missed this today, how engaging should the pastor be in asking for an increased offering from each parishioner in support of the finance committee? At Horizons, we believe that generosity and ultimately giving is a function of the discipleship process. And so it's a twofold answer. One, as the spiritual leader of the church, discipling people to grow in their generosity is absolutely a direct responsibility to you as the spiritual leader. Secondly, demonstrating that is critical. They need to believe that you are generous. If you're talking about a tithe, that you are in fact tithing, and so testifying to that. Third is you are the most powerful voice in the church. Almost always the pastor is. And so there's no one who can more effectively ask people to prayerfully consider growing in their giving than the pastor. I would never write a plan where the finance committee is leading that effort. That's they would be in support of the broader discipleship and support of the broader communication, which is channels that you're already using in the church. And then as a pastor, the messaging that you send out from the pulpit. Next question is, we've seen a significant increase in online viewership, but not seen a similar increase in giving as a result. Even though encouraging electronic giving, what are others seeing and doing, and how do we leverage this increased viewership? To me, Dave, this is a question of engagement. If they're just watching, then they're not engaging. The church that I attend is actually a fairly modest church. We worship a few hundred, but we have added 20 new members during this season who have never worshiped in person. And that has to do with engaging, making sure that your small groups are up, all your doors, right? We've got service opportunities. People are watching online, they're connecting, they're responding. We're following back up. Pastor and staff and leaders are going out and meeting with these folks. In the same way, how effectively you encourage electronic giving is really the measure. And this is one of the big corollaries that Stan has pointed out. The higher level of electronic giving you have, typically the better resourced your church has. So I've got clients who are in the 90% collecting through recurring giving. meaning it's automatically happening, not just online, but it's the recurring giving, and then challenging people to take steps to grow that. And so there are all kinds of strategies around that. I would start with the webinar that is specifically on the website, and that deals with recurring giving. You can look through our videos and our blogs. There are a number of, and some of the other webinars where we talk specifically about growing giving in this time. Or if you'd like to have a conversation with someone from Horizons, would be happy to talk about how we coach churches. Increasingly, we are simply coaching pastors and other staff members in regard to how to guide generosity in their church. And the last question comes from George, specifically for you, Stan, your example of after-school drop-off center. Does a school district provide funding for the church?
That's always a case by case. There's different churches doing that, and it's not necessarily just an after school. Sometimes it's during school, so that parents, especially essential workers that have to go to work, but or anybody that just needs a place, so it could be community based. I think there is some funding that's been it may or may not be through the school. There's sometimes city grants, community grants to partner with the church. So depending on the church's financial stability, and if they're looking at this as a revenue stream versus a ministry outreach, are different ways to look at that. But to expand that a little bit further, what we're finding consistently is the churches that reach out to the community leaders, whether it's city hall, city commissioners, school districts, first responders, the medical community, what do you need and how do we help, is the best way to do and get involved. And then the funding comes with it, rather than just arbitrarily saying this is what we're going to do and then expect everybody to show up and help with it. So find out what the community needs within, let's call it the 6-8 blocks of you. And then the funding will come from that, from local businesses, local foundations, or city support to make this a more viable solution.
Stan, I sure appreciate you being with us today. This is the resource, the electronic, the ebook that you all have put together, How to Budget Effectively in Changing Times. This will be in the 365 Giving resource library, the link to download this. Anything you want to share, Stan, in closing?
Again, Joe, thanks for the opportunity. I want to thank each of the participants today for joining us. Anything we can do to serve them, if you're trying to sort out priorities in your budget and how to make that work, if you're looking at, how can we become more efficient, more automated? How do we, all this online giving has to be tracked back to the general ledger system. So, we want you to help with, getting the online giving and the discipleship going. We want to make sure that it gets processed properly into the systems and efficiently, effectively, with good internal controls. But there's a lot of things that we can just certainly love to help serve the church to make sure that they're putting as many dollars as possible into that community impact, community outreach to further the kingdom.
Stan, thank you so much for being with us today. We look forward to our next webinar where we're going to look at the revenue side. If folks have questions, they can contact you on the Cape and Krause website. All of those touch points will be provided in Giving 365. You'll get a link to that. Thank you for joining us today, and God bless your work.